today's program, a special pre-election 2020 roundtable with a distinguished panel of guests to help us break it all down. Returning to the show is Nancy Maveety, Chair of Political Science at Tulane University and one of the foremost experts of the United States Supreme Court in this country. She's written numerous books, including Strategist on the Supreme Court, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and Representation Rights and the Burger Years. Back for the second time also is legendary conservative political figure and commentator Bill Kristol. The founder of the Weekly Standard, he served as professor at Harvard and UPenn. In addition, he's been the chairman of a number of major think tanks, as well as holding high positions under Reagan and H.W. Bush. And joining us for the first time is Lawrence Douglas, professor of law, jurisprudence, and social thought at Amherst College, the author of 7 books, including The Memory of Judgment, Making Law, and History in the Trials of the Holocaust, and most recently, Will He Go? Trump and the Looming Electoral Meltdown in 2020, a book that seems oddly relevant right now. I'm thrilled to have you all, and for what it's worth, I have to say, I dare say you'd be hard-pressed finding a better panel on any show than the one we have right now. Welcome to all of you. Bill Kristol, to you first. A lot of weird things happening, like Scott Atlas going on Russia Today, giving a weird interview, Biden campaign bus being run off the road in Texas. Are we just careening off a cliff here?
I hope not. I think we're not all careening off a cliff. I mean, the Trump campaign and the Trump administration are trying to lead us off a cliff, and unfortunately, a lot of his supporters are now complicit in that. And so I do think the threats, both of violence and of suppression, of course, we've seen a lot of fights about that already before the election, what might happen on election night and after, that's very worrisome. I mean, we've never had really, at least not in modern times, an incumbent president, really even a major party candidate, I would say, who's engaged in this kind of behavior. I would say that the lawsuit in Houston that's trying, which is supported by the Republican Party of Texas, it's not some rogue individual, extreme, activists, to throw out 120,000 ballots that were cast legally and had been set up and approved by everyone, all the nonpartisan and actually both parties in the county and throughout Texas. It's a drive-in voting, so to speak, curbside, I guess they call it, voting. Totally legitimate, same precautions, the same security that you'd have in any kind of voting, that's any early voting. But Harris County is Democratic, it's Houston. And so the Republicans have decided to try to just chop the Democratic majority, basically, by getting rid of 120,000 votes. I'm not even sure those votes are segregated, so it may not be possible. But of course, that then leads into their next step, which is to throw out not just a segregated bucket of votes that are a little Democratic, but to call into question the entire votes that have been cast. And clearly, that's what they have in mind in a couple of these states, maybe more than a couple, and say, oh, I guess we just never know who won. So maybe the Republican state legislature can appoint electors. So I can't really believe whatever the problems with Bush v. Gore and of individual cases and even statewide cases of making it harder for certain communities to vote than others and so forth, maybe with the exception of race, obviously. I mean, this is we're at an extraordinary moment where one of the two major parties, basically key to its strategy for winning the election is pretty blatant voter suppression and then suppressing the actual counting of all the ballots. And again, that party is led by the President of the United States, which makes it all much more dangerous. I think Lawrence has written about this, but I mean, if you control the executive branch, you control the Justice Department, you control the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, everything gets much scarier than just having some, third-party candidate yelling about how votes should be thrown out or something like that. So I don't think incidentally, I think the margins may be big enough, and I think there's maybe still enough institutional infrastructure to check this in the federal government, maybe even in the Republican Party, but it is an unusual moment, I think.
Nancy Maveety, you were nodding. Is John Roberts losing a lot of sleep tonight? What the hell is he going to do if it goes to him, if it goes to them, to the Supreme Court? Can he hold it together?
Well, before I answer that, as Bill was talking, I was thinking that some of this unrest about suppressing the vote, challenging vote counts, it does raise what are constitutional questions or questions about how electoral law is structured in the United States, with the question, of course, how much latitude should states have in making decisions about their electoral systems and their method of tabulating ballots, their methods of creating opportunities for voting, and also, of course, what entity within the state counts as the state's will or state's perspective. Is it the state Supreme Court, state judiciary, or is it the state legislature? That was, of course, something that was very much at issue in Bush v. Gore. And since you mentioned John Roberts, I'm tying that to John Roberts, which, of course, is to the point that Roberts has staked out kind of an unusual middle ground position among the members of the court right now in terms of adjudicating some of these challenges, challenges to how votes are being counted, extensions of acceptance of absentee ballots. And he has crafted a position which is somewhat of a compromise, although it certainly does not lean to accepting the role of federal judges in striking down particular state arrangements. But he's giving more latitude to state judiciaries, state Supreme Courts, in the constellation of views and discussions about this, and not simply saying we defer to state legislatures, which is, of course, what the other conservatives are arguing. And that's, of course, particularly convenient if you have a state where the state legislature is Republican dominated, to pick up on another thread that that Bill was speaking about. So where John Roberts is tonight is probably like the rest of us, feeling a bit on edge. And it's an unsettling feeling.
Can I just one footnote to Nancy, and I'm sure you want to hear from Lawrence, but yeah, so in the Texas Supreme Court upheld the Harris County to Houston voting today, dismissed the challenge without even an opinion, and so that Texas Supreme Court's entirely appointed by Republican governors, since they have only been Republican governors in Texas for more than 2 decades. It will be interesting to see, I think. There's this very conservative, actually right-wing federal judge that happens, I guess they drew for the hearing tomorrow. It will be interesting to sort of see if somehow what he does, and then if it goes quickly up on appeal, I suppose, how much the appellate and the Supreme Courts, decide to at least, I mean, there are problems with just saying the state court gets to decide, obviously, because they're federal constitutional, presumably, rights and laws at issue, but at least that's a somewhat coherent position. And I think in most cases we have a tradition in this country, for better or worse, the states do have quite a lot of latitude. They've abused it often, but at least that would be sort of consistent. But of course, Trump isn't interested in letting the states decide on their own if it goes against his own interests. He's, in that case, he's very happy to have, he's himself threatened, right? We'll send the Justice Department in. I'm having the lawyers show up in Pennsylvania, he said today at a rally, I think, on election night. Anyway.
Lawrence Douglas, you wrote the book. Well, it came out in the spring. How much has changed between when the book came out, when you wrote it, and now? Are you assuaged at all, or are you on tenterhooks?
Well, I think that we're all in heated agreement about the kind of dangers that the nation faces. I kind of share Bill's maybe guarded optimism that that Trump will be handed a decisive enough electoral defeat, and that we'll get the contours of that electoral defeat early enough such that he's not going to be able to play this game of constitutional brinkmanship that we're all pretty concerned about. But when I wrote the book, I really wrote the book more as a thought experiment. I was basically trying to ask, how well is their system of constitutional and federal law equipped to deal, let's say, with an incumbent president who does something that looks quite unprecedented in American history, namely threatens to engage in active electoral defiance. And I think the answer is that we're not particularly well prepared to deal with a situation like that. And I would say that the likelihood of a situation of something really going sideways is all the greater in the sense that obviously Trump is a very vulnerable candidate, and he's also a dangerous candidate. And, we don't need to look much past the statements that issue from the president himself. Whatever else we might say about Donald Trump, he's not particularly sneaky fellow. I mean, he's pretty transparent in what he's planning to do. And I think the question remains as to what happens on election day and in the following days to see whether he actually can really kind of engage in this constitutional brinkmanship. I think, again, it will turn on the outcome. And again, we might not know the outcome directly on November 3rd, but hopefully if we get the sense of a substantial defeat for him within, let's say, a few days, I do think he'll be pretty checked in his interest in really kind of muddying the waters and making for a very difficult and happy electoral season for us all.
I mean, presumably, even if he's not checked, I think what you're implying really is that others wouldn't go along. I mean, for me, that's the huge story. It's the huge story of the Trump presidency. So,
Right.
You can have a guy in the White House screaming and yelling and saying, I'm not leaving. It doesn't matter if the other people in the cabinet officials in the executive branch pay no attention, so to speak, or just say, I'm sorry, we're going ahead with the constitutional process. It doesn't matter if the governors or the most senior Republican, maybe in the state legislatures in relevant states, say, I'm sorry. If Ron DeSantis said today, he's the Republican governor of Florida, look, we're going to count the ballots. It's complicated. We've had our disputes in Florida, but we've also, to be fair to them, they've had very big, close elections, which they've resolved reasonably cleanly after a couple of days of extra counting sometimes. The 2018, his own election was unclear on election night, remember? But we're going to do it. We know what we're doing. I've got good election officials. Mr. President, don't worry about it, but don't try to announce the winner if it's very close at 11 p.m. If the Republican, I don't know who the most senior Republican in Pennsylvania is, but I suppose the leader of the state legislature or something said the same thing, that would change things a lot. What for me is so terrible, really, and this is a broader problem with the Trump presidency, is the total silence, or even in some cases complicity, of the elected officials at the federal and state levels, and the increasingly, unfortunately, the cabinet officials in the executive branch. And they're what makes it possible. Otherwise, you just have a sort of, president who's got a little, not just, but you have a president who's kind of got a little off his rocker, but no one is actually implementing this. But I mean, are we confident that, again, I agree, if it's not close, it's hard to believe that even the Republicans who got along with Trump for so much are going to think that's an appropriate thing to do, but I don't know.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, if I just can follow up on that, I think if it is the case that the election ends up turning on the late count of mail-in ballots in a handful of swing states, that's where you could really see Trump's attempt to muddy the waters gaining traction. And I think exactly as Bill's pointed out, I mean, it's more than simply the kind of silence on the part of members of the Republican Party. It's really kind of aiding and abetting his abuses of the presidency over the recent years. And I do fear that if they see that there is some kind of genuine political gains that they could get from backing him up in his attempt to muddying the waters, they will do so.
Nancy, if you could, well, you've written 2 books on Sandra Day O'Connor, so you've studied her role. You've written about the Berger years and many other books about the court, but did you ever think there would be such a strange situation as Amy Coney Barrett saying that she didn't know, she couldn't comment on if the election date was fixed or if a peaceful transition of power? I mean, and then Jonathan Turley, who was one of the witnesses for the president in the impeachment trial, wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying that Amy Coney Barrett's testimony was the most transparent since Robert Bork, and it was a stunningly transparent. I mean, how weird is this? I found her testimony very untransparent, but that was maybe just me.
Well, I mean, I think what it shows is the trajectory in the way the confirmation hearings have developed over the last several decades. I mean, I think what we see is, a very studied effort to create a particular impression without saying much of anything at all. And, over the last several confirmation hearings, we've seen less and less actual detailed responses, even to the point of speaking about, what are widely accepted precedents, with this particular message that, well, I cannot take a comment or a stance on any active issue of law. But, the Amy Coney Barrett nomination and confirmation was so unusual in so many ways. It's hard to know what to stop and pay notice of. I think it was worrisome that there wasn't a bit more of an aggressive statement from her about the importance of the rule of law and the role of the judiciary in protecting the electoral system. But I'm not particularly surprised that she was very much backpedaling on any of those questions that might have backfired if she'd answered them inappropriately, might have backfired in terms of presenting an image of her that was not acceptable to the administration. And I suppose the way to think about Turley's commentary and others is, it's very important to put the appropriate spin on what a nominee says in confirmation hearings. And presidents usually, presidents or their surrogates, I'm not saying Turley is a presidential surrogate necessarily, but surrogates like Mike Pence, for example, are often part of the effort to do what's called go public, use public opinion as a tool to try to motivate and mobilize support. Now, of course, it was never really a question whether she would be confirmed or not by the Republican Senate. But I think it was important for, again, presidential surrogates to give an appropriate atmosphere to what was being said and what her confirmation hearing looked like. Again, to legitimize what was already a somewhat unusual, I'll just stay with that adjective, unusual process.
What struck me though, Nancy, was, and maybe this is such inside baseball, it only struck me, but I worked in the White House, once, so was when, fine, she gets confirmed, let's, as you say, leave aside all the unusual aspects of that. And then the president decides he wants to have her swearing in at the White House before a big crowd with that bizarre balcony, Mussolini-like balcony thing.
Oh, yes.
And there, I don't remember, I haven't looked this closely, your court, I mean, I don't think previous justices were normally sworn in at the White House.
No.
They're usually sworn at the court, I think. And I think the symbolism there was always, of course, once you're the president's nominee, so whatever, but the moment you're confirmed, you're on the court and you're in a different branch and you might have to judge, you will have to judge, certainly many cases that will involve the president and his administration. So you sort of doesn't mean you never deal with the president or never go to dinner at the White House or something, but you try to avoid that looking as if it's a partisan victory for the president and his team and party. And the fact that maybe she just, I mean, it was the personal, you get told there's going to be a huge ceremony, the president, Justice Thomas is showing up to swear you in. I can understand it's a human thing. You've got a few hours. It's a little hard to say, no, I'm not coming. I mean, that would be, but I've got to think Chief Justice Roberts, this is the one, I do know him a little bit. I bet he was not happy about that. I mean, he's been very, diligent in trying to keep the court sort of separate from this kind of thing. And I'm sure he assumed that the swearing in would be the next morning at the court. Yes. He could do it, or any of them could do it. And instead, they get someone fairly or unfairly who's viewed as one of the more partisan justices to come to the White House. And again, even if it was a dignified swearing in with the family there in a room, okay. But before 200 people cheering and Republicans only.
Oh yeah, the optics were strange, weren't they? And of course, this dead of night kind of atmosphere only added to the strangeness. What it reminded me of was, of course, Donald Trump utilizing, again, the White House as the backdrop for the acceptance of the Republican nomination, for the acceptance of his party's nomination. Now, you might say, well, this was a virtual convention. Everything was different about both of the party conventions. But of course, the optics there were also to use the trappings of the institution of the White House, of the presidency, to legitimize what is in fact a party ceremony, a party action, not a governmental action. And so I think utilizing these kinds of symbols and this kind of symbolism is something that we've seen this president do. And in a way, it is blurring the distinction between, you know, the government and himself, or the government and the particular partisan position he represents. And I think
wish,
that's, yeah.
I just wish Justice Barrett had said no. And I mean, I think it would have, and I still have hopes, actually. I don't, that she will not be a entirely partisan justice and so forth, but maybe she'll recuse herself in some of these cases. Maybe she'll decide that she'll judge on the merits, so she's not going to be some kind of Trump loyalist if something comes up to the court in 2 or 4 or 6 weeks. But that was a bad, symbolically, I thought, a bad choice of hers to go to the White House.
Lawrence Douglas, you said that it was a thought experiment, your book, and it seems more real by the day. So come 36 hours from now, it's now Sunday evening. Come Tuesday the 3rd, around 8, 9 o'clock. Some states we're going to know very quickly. James Carville made a good point that you have to look at certain counties, bellwether counties. He said, look at Seminole County in Florida, look at Gwinnett County in Georgia, look at Collin County in Texas, look at Hamilton County in Ohio, etc. For these early returns. Is Trump going to be extricated from the White House easily? Scaramucci, in the New Yorker article by Jane Mayer, which you were quoted as well, Scaramucci said, oh yeah, he's going to pack his bags and leave. You don't seem to think so.
No, don't get me wrong. I mean, I've never said that Trump is going to somehow barricade himself in the Oval Office on January 20th, surrounded by a phalanx of rogue Secret Service agents, and that he's going to need to be frog marched out of the White House by members of the military. I don't think it would come to that at all. First of all, I just don't think, in terms of the brand protection, he would ever let it come to that. The danger I see is really in the period from November 3rd until January 20th. And again, what I said before about his capacity to muddy the waters. That is, if, for example, if he has some kind of lead on November 3rd, and it's not inconceivable that he would have a lead, given the fact that we'll have tens of millions of mail-in ballots yet to be counted, that he would then try to leverage that lead into a claim of victory. Now, he might not do it on election day itself, but again, if the margins are pretty narrow for a couple of days, he's already expressed impatience with the count of mail-in ballots. He's, various used words like bedlam. In fact, we saw that word bedlam being echoed, unfortunately, by Brett Kavanaugh. We talked about the possibility of chaos if we don't know early enough who has captured the White House. And so again, the danger, I think, is that he would try to leverage a lead into a claim of victory, and then try to denigrate the loss of that lead once the mail-ins once the mail-ins get counted. That is, try to say, look, I mean, this is everything that I've been predicting. The mail-in ballots have been rigged, they've been corrupted, and we have to go with the November 3rd results. And that's also emerged as something, as a kind of leitmotif of his attacks on the electoral process. This insistence that we have to go with November 3rd results, and we need to disqualify any results that are changed through the count of mail-in ballots.
This coming from a man who, of course, voted by mail, right?
Yeah.
Well, again, I mean, he's been attacking the mail-in ballot. I mean, he's been attacking the electoral system since he first emerged as a candidate in 2015. And he's kind of created this narrative that the only way that our electoral system can demonstrate its legitimacy is if he wins. And if he loses, that simply becomes de facto evidence of everything he's been saying, that the system is rigged, the deep state is against him. And I think what's unusual in this election system is simply that he has this kind of new bête noire to kind of focus his corrosive energies about the electoral system on, namely mail-in ballots. And it makes sense for him to attack mail-in ballots, since we know they're going to break heavily in Biden's favor. So there's obviously a politics behind these, in a sense, kind of baseless attacks on the integrity of mail-in ballots.
But just to put some color on this thought experiment, this unnerving thought experiment, So let's assume he holds Florida and North Carolina or narrowly, or maybe they're just undecided. And Pennsylvania looks like the tipping point, and he's ahead in Pennsylvania because Pennsylvania, unlike some of these other states, reserves the counting of early votes, both I think mail-in and maybe early in-person voting until after they count the election day vote. This is various bizarre reasons of election administration. That's what that state, some states do that, others not so much. Pennsylvania's never had much early votes, so it sort of was an academic thing mostly. Anyway, so it's 11 p.m. Trump looks like he has a chance to win. Pennsylvania is the tipping point state. Trump's ahead. I mean, yes, he could declare victory. Could he use parts of the federal government to try to sort of stop some of the other counting? That would be pretty hard because the counting is so state governed, but you do have the National Guard and the Justice Department. You could at least muddy the waters with sending observers in, but you could also, and this is what very worrisome, I think, he can call on people to march on Philadelphia, on Harrisburg.
Yes.
Exactly. Can't let us steal this. I want my supporters to go and don't go unarmed because who knows? Yes. I don't know what Pennsylvania's laws are, open carry and so forth, but don't go unarmed because they'll be out there. Antifa will be out there. You've got to go march on the state capitol and make sure they don't steal this election. I mean, you could have this is, I don't think, going to happen, but it's not inconceivable. Look at the stupid stuff that's happening even this weekend with these, the Biden bus. No one was hurt in Texas, and then here in Washington, they sort of jammed up the Beltway for a couple of hours with some parade of trucks, and it's a Sunday, so hopefully no one was stopped, no ambulance was stopped from getting anywhere, but it's mostly just a silly little inconvenience for people trying to get somewhere. But what if suddenly in 3 different state capitals, we have mobs descending on it, and then of course the left will correctly say, well, we have to show our strength, and we could have something that looks much more like what you see in third world countries than traditionally here.
But isn't it telling that already 2 days before you see that Macy's in Midtown Manhattan is boarding up, and it's happening all over the place. Cities are putting on the big plywood boards over the windows because it's expected. I mean, as an American citizen, I find that pretty shameful and abhorrent that the expectation is our shop's going to be trashed 2 days from now. It's amazing.
I mean, I think we don't want to be alarmists here, but we don't want to underestimate the power of social media in terms of the connectivity that it provides. So if we think about Donald Trump utilizing Twitter to stir up angst about the results and about whether they are fair and whether they are accurate, that sets off a chain that doesn't even need to involve Donald Trump anymore. Now it involves what is essentially the mobilization power that social media creates. And I think it's worrisome. I do think so. I mean, I think that's a new feature of what we're all talking about, an element of American politics, a kind of extremism, a motivated populism that we have not seen to this degree since, I don't know, what do you want to say, the 1930s perhaps? The parallels aren't necessarily close and accurate, but that to me is something that is different about this environment. And it does lie with the president to initiate that if he so chooses. I'm not sure I'm quite as optimistic as the gentleman that this president will show restraint, or that he would listen to the voices of restrained elected Republicans, other elected Republicans. He really hasn't shown much evidence of doing that. I don't know why we would expect it in this context, where there is so much at stake for this president if he does lose. So much at stake in terms of his personal finances, personal legal liability. If that should be thought of as part of the equation too, I think.
Yeah, I think maybe Bill can jump in as well if I mischaracterize the position. I mean, I don't think, I describe myself generally as having a catastrophic imagination, which I think is probably one of the reasons why I wrote this book in the first place. So I don't think I'm necessarily inclined to optimism. But I think the only point that I was trying to make was that if he loses very decisively, I really do think that his opportunities for, now he can certainly make for mayhem. That is, he can certainly engage in his dog whistle. He can certainly try to tell his, tens of millions of fervent supporters that the deep state is conspiring against him. I just think at the end of the day, we will see Joe Biden inaugurated on January 20th, and we will see Donald Trump out of the White House. Now, he might move very quickly from the White House into Sean Hannity's studio and continue to spread his toxicity. But that's what I just meant in terms of the way in which I think GOP lawmakers could actually put pressure on him, not necessarily to concede, that is, I never imagined that he will accept the legitimacy of the loss, but to submit, that is, to just recognize that further actual fighting is just not going to score him any political successes.
Yeah, or just that if the enablers stop enabling, he may never concede, but it's just not going to have nearly as much effect. I mean,
Right.
This is true even of the scenario of the mobilizing crowds, which I sort of agree is be a very bad thing for America, but it doesn't really ultimately change what happens probably on January 20th. But it can cause a lot of mayhem. But even there, we shouldn't lose sight of the responsibility of the enablers. I mean, it will matter if Sean Hannity, since you mentioned him, Tucker Carlson, do they just rah when Trump says that, or does one of them have the nerve and the decency, honestly, to say, well, I don't know, let's just wait until the votes get counted here. I think the president's gone a little far. Or does Rupert Murdoch send out orders that Fox should not magnify the false claims of vote fraud and have a calmer attitude? And obviously, if Chris Wallace dominates not to get into the weeds, but it does matter actually.
Absolutely.
If sort of Chris Wallace type dominates Fox coverage on Tuesday night, it's a different world, a little bit of a different world. Social media is a little less easy to control, but there are people there, influencers, who would probably make a bit of a difference. So again, it's the enablers who've made so much of this possible when you think about it, both in the public and private sectors, really. And that's where one hopes that they would sort of think this is just a bridge too far.
Nancy, what do you think about the pressures that are going to be on Amy Coney Barrett to recuse or to consider differently? I mean, you've spoken on this show a lot about John Roberts and his commitment to the institution of the court. How powerful is he going to be if push comes to shove?
Well, I mean, we could talk about that from a couple of different perspectives. I think what I would want to say, that I think you and I have talked about in the past as well, is the institution and the institution's legitimacy matter to all the members of the court. I mean, they all have a buy-in into that. I mean, that is part of who they are. They are invested in the independence and the legitimacy of their institution. I think the Chief Justice has a special relationship with the idea of the court's institutional legitimacy, simply because the court carries that Chief Justice's name, and the Chief Justice does run the court in that sense. So obviously, we know that about John Roberts. I think it makes him a fine chief, in fact. I wouldn't want to say that the associate justices are not also committed to that idea, but justices can disagree about what the appropriate path to judicial independence or legitimacy looks like. And recusal, after all, is to a large degree for justices left to the own responsibility and discretion of that judge. It's a bit different than for other judges. So what we can expect from Amy Coney Barrett, I mean, I have no reason to think that she's not a person of integrity. I don't happen to agree with some of her views, either jurisprudential or probably policy. Not exactly sure what her policy views are, but I don't think I have cause to be suspicious that she's simply a tool or would act that way. I think it creates just a very difficult environment for the court, because once all eyes are focused on how the court is responding, if this becomes some kind of contested election that requires the court's intervention or adjudication, as happened in Bush versus Gore, well, that just dredges up the memory of Bush versus Gore, which I think if we look back, we have to realize how well institutions responded there, and how much the strength and resilience of our institutions mattered. to get through what could have been, a very tempestuous, it was tempestuous, but an even more tempestuous political situation. I think things have changed a bit since then, though, in terms of trust in institutions, in terms of the connection that elected officials sometimes have with their institutions as opposed to their parties. And this is why some political scientists talk about the phenomenon of the partisan presidency, that the role of parties and party loyalty and party affiliation has become so much stronger in such a way that it has altered to some degree some of the expectations we've had about separation of powers. And so those are some of the dynamics that I think are at work and must be considered and thought about in this situation.
Lawrence Douglas, were you going to add something? I saw.
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, the one thing that I might just follow up on, this might be an obvious point, but, I do think that if we go back to, let's say, Bush v. Gore in the year 2000, I think it would be wrong to claim, and this is not suggesting that this is what Nancy was saying, but I think it would be wrong to claim that that the court, for better or worse, brought closure to that electoral dispute.
No, it was Al Gore that brought closure.
It was Al Gore. It was Al Gore who did so.
Absolutely.
And, there's no doubt that Gore basically put the interests of the nation ahead of his own political fortunes. And it's impossible to imagine Donald Trump acting in a similar fashion. So, if we imagine, kind of a thought experiment of slotting Donald Trump into the year 2000, we would have had a genuine electoral nightmare. And I think what has really spared us in our history from these genuine electoral nightmares has been a combination of luck and the character of people seeking higher office. Because again, I don't think at least our electoral processes are not particularly well designed to avoid this type of mess.
Bill Kristol, the question that you probably think about a lot, that's sort of the biggest question is what happens after, and I know no one here is a Nostradamus, but if you picture, you wrote a fascinating article that you've talked about on the Bulwark podcast and other places, in which you laid out these three election scenarios: a loss of a mild loss, a significant loss, and a total trouncing. And what you say is that the future of the Republican Party depends on which of these scenarios. Can you give a little summation of that? And what, obviously, it's been a week since you wrote that article, but things are already different.
It just occurred to me, and not just what the future of the Republican Party, but the future of politics in general often depends on, obviously, the size of an incoming president's victory. That's particularly the case, though, with if you defeat an incumbent president. It doesn't happen that often. We tend to re-elect presidents. That's the vague expectation, I think, is that people will have 8 years if they don't mess up, or if they're doing just a little bit above adequate. So people, the last three obviously have gotten re-elected. Clinton, Bush, and Obama. If Trump loses, he'll be the fourth president to lose a re-election bid. So not appointed incumbents, but actual people who won office in a century. Hoover, Carter, and George H.W. Bush being the first three. He'll be incidentally only the second to have his party lose the White House after 4 years. Again, the 8-year expectation. George H.W. Bush lost after 8 years of Reagan. It was in effect 12 years of Reagan-Bush. People were a little tired of it. Hoover was 12 years of Republican rule as well. So it's a pretty big deal when voters throw out the incumbent. And so it can have pretty big effects, especially if it's a really decisive throwing out. Hoover lost and, by 17 points, and for other reasons as well. No, except for Eisenhower's 8 years, he was elected as a World War II hero, not so much as a Republican. Democrats controlled the White House until 1968. Think about that. It's 36 years, except for Eisenhower, That's the biggest kind of loss. New Deal happens, the Great Society happens, a lot happens. Civil rights. I'd say Reagan in 80, beating Carter is kind of an in-between scenario. Pretty big consequences. Republicans win the Senate. 12 years of control. A lot of policy gets changed. Not FDR New Deal level consequences, probably. And then George H.W. Bush, I was in that White House. We lost by 5.5 points, 5.7, I think, in 92. We didn't lose any seats in Congress. It was, people were tired of Reagan, Bush, the Cold War was over, et cetera. It wasn't really a repudiation quite though. And so 2 years later, Republicans won Congress and politics chugged along, and it wasn't sort of a decisive moment. I think you could say an inflection point, really. There are some interesting things about it, but an inflection point in our politics. So I think it will matter the size of the victory. I think the thing that matters most, apart from the pure scope of the victory, is do Republicans hold the Senate? I think the psychology next week, but also early in next year, if Trump has lost, but Republicans have held the Senate, even if they lose a couple of seats, will be, he lost. He was kind of, he was ridiculous. He made it hard for people to vote to reelect him. But, it wasn't a partisan shellacking. And in fact, Biden will have to be presumably working with McConnell, and, there'll be, it won't look like the Republican Party just went totally off the rails and it's a massive repudiation of Trumpy republicanism. If Republicans lose the Senate as well, it's easier to say he dragged them down. They've controlled the Senate, and because of Trump, they lost. The Democrats now run everything, president in both houses. And if the bigger the loss, then the easier it is to say that the whole Trump thing was a nightmare for the party. I'm not so optimistic. I mean, I'm pretty optimistic that it'll be a pretty big defeat, but I would say the people are probably too optimistic, if you don't like Trump, and hoping that the party could just liberate itself from Trump and Trumpism very quickly. I'm not super optimistic about that. But it would be easier for those of us who would like to see that happen if there's a bigger defeat. And certainly I do think the Senate, it will feel different. Think of it, Thursday morning, by the time we know probably all these races, if it's, Biden has won 360 electoral votes and there are 52 Democratic senators, that will have a different feel from Biden winning with 297 electoral votes and McConnell is still majority leader. I think that's the big distinction. I don't think we're going to get a Herbert Hoover type situation quite.
Lawrence Douglas, you said that tin pot dictatorship is something that has to be avoided. Do you think Cy Vance, you think Letitia James up in New York are going to take your words to heart? Or if Trump loses, are they going to go to town?
Well, I think just to kind of expand on the comments that I made, I think the point that I was trying to make was that in general proposition, I don't think it's a healthy thing for a nation to try to cast political opponents as enemies and then to make enemies into criminals. That seems to be the kind of thing that dictatorships do. It's not the kind of thing that democracies do. At the same time, I think I was trying to make the observation that a healthy democracy also should have the capacity to bring criminal charges against a former head of state if, in fact, that head of state genuinely has committed crimes. And my own belief is that it would be a much better thing to do to bring charges against actions that took place when, let's say, Trump was not in office rather than when he was in office. Because again, if you bring charges against actions conducted while he was in office, it creates the impression, the optics that you're really just trying to settle scores through the criminal law, which strikes me as a very, very bad thing to do. So that's why I was just trying to make the argument that if there were to be any kind of legal exposure for the former president, assuming that he becomes a former president, it would best be done on the state level by Cyrus Vance, looking into things such as, tax fraud or any of these other kind of Al Capone-like crimes.
Nancy, it seems to me that ideally the Supreme Court or any court would have nothing to do with any of this. But courts already have, and the Supreme Court already has, and a lot may go to the Supreme Court. Do you wish there were a Sandra Day O'Connor on the court now, or a someone from the past? Is there someone from the past who you wish would be on the court right now?
John Marshall Harlan. No, I mean, I think we have some voices and forces on the court who I think very much replicate some of those moderate tendencies and also contextually oriented ways of looking at things. I think Elena Kagan is such a justice, for example. But we do have to be mindful of the fact that this is a GOP appointee dominated court, and so a conservative bloc does control, or at least on paper, controls the disposition of cases. What I think is interesting about this whole situation, both the Supreme Court situation and also what Bill was talking about regarding the fortunes of the Republican Party and what the Republican Party looks like now. Is it a Trump party or not? I mean, this opens up the question of what conservatism means and what conservatism is in the context of this very fraught experience of this kind of president and the kind of actions that we've seen from this president, and also just some of the enabling that occurred by other actors. And I would include Majority Leader McConnell in that. I mean, it was very important for the Republican Party to achieve the goal of staffing the federal judiciary with those kind of candidates that were considered important candidates to place on the federal courts. And that became an interest that was an overpowering interest that allowed enabling of some of the more noxious behaviors of Donald Trump, simply because he was a route to getting something that was important to some conservatives in the Republican coalition, or to most conservatives in the Republican coalition. So, if we're already speculating about the post-Trump scenario, I think there are a lot of questions here about what the experience of him winning in 2016 and gaining traction within the party, what that tells us, excuse me, about the nature of public opinion and of public attitudes about government, about democracy, about policy, and what this experience might teach us, either as members of the Republican Party, members of the Democratic Party, and also to reflect on what conservatism really means for Republicans.
I know we don't have all the time in the world. Bill Kristol, do you have any last minute sage words? Know that they have a short expiration date. Whatever you say, it may change the second we hang up this call.
I mean, I'm not that optimistic about conservatism either. So it's absolutely the right question or set of questions, and obviously they're being discussed and will be discussed a lot. And I think a lot does depend. I'd say history remains contingent, and a lot depends on what people do not just on Tuesday and over the next days and weeks, and then really over the next months and years. I mean, a lot of this I'm involved in, as you can imagine, endless discussions about, they try to get me involved in the future of the Republican Party, future of conservatism, let's have a meeting, let's have a Zoom call on this, let's have that. And I usually point out, it sort of matters what Joe Biden does, assuming he becomes president. I mean, does Biden have a successful presidency or a failed one? Is it a successful moderate presidency, or is it a successful more left-wing presidency, or is it a failed moderate presidency? I mean, he could just get unlucky and say, I'm not saying he could do his best and make intelligent decisions, and the world is the world and the economy is the economy, and he could end up in a bad situation in a couple of years, or the opposite. So a lot depends on, and then of course what the particular Republican office holders do. I mean, they're not, they have agency, as we say these days, and they should be held accountable for what they do. And a lot of them are going to, I think, pretend that Trump never existed. And for people like me, who's been fighting Trump within the party, I mean, I'm going to be annoyed by their pretense and not going to feel like working with them for a while. But that's just me, honestly, and that most people are going to say, fine, let's just move on. And look, it's better for the country. This sort of gets to Lawrence's point. Pure justice might involve raking them over the coals for every horrible thing they did and didn't do over the last 3 and 4 years in terms of sucking up to Trump and accommodating Trump and not holding him accountable. But in the real world, if you want to have a viable center-right party, maybe it's better to just let them kind of move. Most of them move on. But then, what will happen in 20 years? Another, just I'll close with this. What will happen in 2022? I don't know. Who's going to win Republican primaries? There'll be a lot of open seats. Who are the new candidates going to be? Are there going to be new candidates like the Democratic new candidates in 2018? A lot of whom were moderate. In my state of Virginia, ex-military, ex-CIA, a lot of women, but and moderate women, actually. So the women got the headline, not the moderate, but actually it's a pretty impressive class from my point of view. There's AOC, I mean, it's a mixed, mixed ideologically. She's impressive too in her way, but it's the Democratic Party, I think, is actually more diverse ideologically than conservatives realize. The Republican Party right now isn't, and maybe it is a little beneath the surface, but it's certainly been kept beneath the surface. But who's going to run in 2022? What young people are going to show up? Who's going to run in big seats? There's going to be an open Senate seat in Pennsylvania. And who's going to win? Where's the Republican electorate? Because people like me can have nice conversations with intelligent 37-year-olds saying, hey, you should run. You're the kind of McCain, Bush Republican someone like me would like to see. And I could probably introduce you to some people and give you some help and all this. But
I'm only 31 years old.
But those people, so this, a few of those people tried in 2018 and 2020, and they got crushed in primaries. I mean, they got crushed so badly, no one's ever heard of them because they kind of they pulled out half the time because people, it was so obvious they were going to get crushed. But do I have confidence that the Trumpy voters won't continue rewarding Trumpiness in Republican primaries, and not just in Georgia and Florida, but what about in Pennsylvania and elsewhere? Massachusetts, I mean, Lawrence's, I think, they had a choice in 2018 of having an intelligent opponent to Elizabeth Warren or having a kind of a Trumpy one, and they picked Massachusetts Republicans went that way. So I think there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of questions. The voters have a say, the elites have a say, events have a say. It's going to be, but I think it's going to be a pretty uncharted waters, certainly for the Republican Party, certainly for conservatism, for the reasons Nancy said, but a little bit for the Democratic Party too. It's not like Biden, I mean, he's probably a one-term president and a bit of a transitional figure. So where do the Democrats go? And so what are the after effects of Trump and Trumpism? There are an awful lot of questions that we're not quite used to having, I think, in American politics.
Lawrence Douglas, finish it out. Any last words here?
Yeah, actually, I was just going to maybe follow up on the last thing that Bill mentioned, this business about, what is the longer legacy of Trump and Trumpism? And, is it possible for us to walk back some of the more toxic things that we've seen in the last few years? And I think that really is an open question. I mean, the way in which, Trump is kind of elevating lying into a first principle of governance. I mean, is that something that has kind of demonstrated a kind of a disturbing efficacy? And so it's going to be something where, maybe Democrats also follow, they've learned something from that type of demagoguery. Just in terms of his erosion in faith in our electoral system, that seems to be a very disturbing legacy. The degree to which he's been successful in kind of casting doubt about the very legitimacy of our democratic processes, and how do you walk that back? How do you walk that back, and how do you restore confidence in the system? I mean, all those things I think are kind of all these, TBAs, to be announced, and it's going to be very, very difficult. And I think at the very least we could say it's not so much that we can imagine a return to a pre-Trumpian universe. I mean, I do think that the landscape has been altered, and maybe altered is the wrong word. The landscape has been scarred. Maybe it's sort of like what we see after you put out the fires in California, and now you have to kind of imagine ways to kind of restore health to the land. And I think that will be a kind of a very central political challenge in the coming years.
Restoring health to the land. Let's hope that can happen. That's a nice image to leave on. I said at the beginning I didn't think you'd find a better panel on any show, and I think I was right. Nancy Maveety, Bill Kristol, Lawrence Douglas. It was great. I hope we can do it again. We just scratched the surface, so we'll keep tuned in, and I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.